Do you want to make your own belly dance pantaloons? You can, and I'm going to show you how in this video. Before I continue, I just want to let you know that I have also written a tutorial on this that has all the steps that I'm going to cover here, as well as a downloadable and printable measurement sheet. You can get this for free on my website, and I'll include the link in the description below. All right, on to sewing pantaloons. So first you need to pick your fabric, and you might know exactly what fabric you want, but if you don't, here are some guidelines. So for the sewing techniques that I'm going to cover here, you want to stick with fabrics that are not see-through. If you're using a see-through fabric like a chiffon, you'll want to do much more involved finishing techniques so the inside of your garment looks good. Also, if you're new to sewing, stick with less flimsy or less slippery fabrics. They're easier to work with than slippery stuff like charmeuse satin and chiffon. At least charmeuse satin isn't see-through. If you want something lightweight and airy, you can try something like this crinkle satin or this garment lining, which is kind of fun. It's just a polyester garment lining and it's super easy to sew. For more folkloric looks, you can go with quilting cottons, or my favorite is cotton batik. Stick to lighter weight fabrics. The heavier the fabric, the more the elastic is going to have to hold that up on you. And we're doing an elastic waistband, and so you want to make sure that you're not really having to make super tight elastic to hold those pantaloons up. Also, I like to use fabric that is washable because the pantaloons do sit closer to the body, and so I usually want to wash them, but also they drag on the floor, so often they'll be something that gets pretty dirty. Okay, so once you know what kind of fabric you want, you'll need to know how much fabric to buy. You'll need enough fabric to make 2 legs, and the way I make my pantaloons, I use the full width of the fabric for 1 leg. And so, for example, if I need 48 inches for 1 leg, I'll need 48 times 2, 96 inches to get both legs. This will make really full pantaloons, but it also makes it a little easier to sew. So how much fabric do you really need? You'll need to calculate the total length for each leg, and then you'll double it. Then convert that. So I usually measure mine in inches, and then when I double it, I've got a bunch of inches, and then take that and convert it to yards. So take your total number of inches, divide it by 36, and then you'll get your yardage. So let's talk about calculating that total leg length. First, you'll need the length of your pantaloon from where you want it to sit at your hip or waist all the way to the floor. And then you'll want to add some extra for blouse. And that's usually like 4 to 6 inches, and it's a personal preference. And it's going to depend on your style and how much you dance outside. So if you dance outside on like asphalt or concrete a lot, you might not want them to drag on the floor because they will wear out faster. So it's something to keep in mind. Okay, so the total leg length. You'll have your total length from your hip or wherever you want it to sit all the way down to the floor, and then add some amount of drape. And then you'll need to add some length for the casing. So I usually add 2 inches for the casing on the top and 1 inch for the casing on the bottom. I use 1 inch elastic on the top and somewhere between 1/4 inch and 3/8 inch elastic on the legs. So for example, if I have a 36 inch top of the hip to floor, plus I want, let's say, 4 inches of blouse, and then I have the extra 3 inches of casing, so 2 on the top, 1 on the bottom. So that's a total of 43 inches. So 36 plus 4 plus 3. So 43 inches, and then I have to multiply that by 2, and I get 86 inches. And so then I can divide that by 36 inches, and that'll give me the number of yards. That comes out to 2.38. I could just get 2 and 3/8 yard, but I would prefer to round up to 2.5 yards. Oftentimes when you buy fabric, the bottoms aren't, or the edges, or the ends that you get cut aren't cut square, and so you end up losing a little bit there. Also, if you're going with a cotton, there's a chance it'll shrink. And so you do want to get a little extra so that you don't make your pantaloons and end up having them like 4 inches shorter than you thought they were going to be. Incidentally, the download that I have shows a bunch of different options for that blouse on the bottom, and a way to use a tape measure with an ankle elastic to figure out about how much drape you want to add. All right, so you will need elastic. I usually take my measurements for the elastic after I've made the pantaloon, but you definitely want enough to go around your waist plus 1 inch. I use an inch overlap, and you'll want it tight enough that it holds the pantaloons up, but not so tight that it just sucks you in and creates a divot in your body, if you can help it. If your pantaloons are really heavy, you'll need to have a tighter elastic. For the bottom elastic, I just use like a regular braided 1/4 inch or 3/8 inch elastic. The top one you can use either no roll. Actually, you can use any of the three types of elastic. You can use braided, knit, or no roll, and it doesn't really matter. When I'm cutting the elastic, I usually err on the side of too big because I can always make it shorter, but having to make it a little bit longer is a little bit harder. For the elastic on the ankle, I often measure around my ankle and with the elastic, and then I make sure that that loop of elastic can fit on and off my foot. So I don't want my elastic so tight that I can't get my foot through it. And remember that it's going to have a lot of fabric also bunched around it, so it's actually going to be slightly smaller feeling than just the elastic alone. You want it to gather in at your ankle, but it doesn't have to be a super tight fit necessarily. And so it can be a little bit loose, and make sure just that it's comfortable. Whatever that length is, add that extra inch for overlap for adjoining it, and then cut 2 pieces in that same length. Definitely make sure that you pre-shrink your fabric. So if it's not a washable fabric for some reason and you still want to treat it in some way, definitely pre-treat it in the way that you would treat it afterwards. So if you're going to take it to the dry cleaners, dry clean the fabric. If you're just doing a dry cleaner secret or some sort of dry L in your dryer, do that. If it's washable and you want to wash it, go ahead and wash it. You can pre-shrink some fabrics without washing them with just heat and steam, but do something, because the last thing you want is to go through the work of making a pair of pantaloons and then having them too short, because that does not look the way you want them to usually. All right, so speaking of calculations, in the sheet you also have a crotch curve calculation, and so this is going to help you just determine both the depth of your crotch and the width of the crotch extension. And so that's the width of the crotch extension is the part that goes underneath your leg, underneath your crotch. The depth is the part that goes from the crotch to your waist. And so to measure the depth, sit on a hard bench or some sort of stool that's hard and measure from where you want the pantaloons to sit all the way down to the bench. That's your crotch depth. To get the crotch depth for drawing on the pattern, you'll add the 2 inches of your casing plus an inch of ease. So your crotch depth will actually sit a little bit lower than your body, which you want for moving around in. In order to get the crotch extension, you could estimate this, but I just use a really quick calculation, and that is take your hip measurement, which is the widest part below your waist, usually around your bum. Take that measurement and divide it in 2. And so you're basically working on half your body. Then subtract that from your thigh circumference. And so the half of your body, of your hip, should be a little bit shorter than your thigh. All right, so you have your thigh circumference minus half of your hip circumference. That distance, add 0 to 2 inches for ease. When we sew, we'll be sewing that to itself. So you'll actually have twice that amount of space in your body, but we actually have to subtract out some for seam allowance. And so just go with that. The wider this is, or the bigger the number, the more space your body will have to fit in. And I prefer that, having a little bit more space in my pantaloons than to have them super tight in that crotch area. Keep in mind that the more width you have on this crotch extension, the less fabric you will have for going around your hips. So if your fabric is super narrow, you may need to adjust your crotch extension to allow for enough fabric to go around your hips, or you may need to pick a different fabric or do a different technique. Okay, so once your fabric is all pre-shrunk and ready to go, we need to cut it out. First, cut your fabric into 2 pieces, each the total leg length, and try to get those edges or the ends perpendicular to the selvage edge. The selvage edge is the finished edge of the fabric. Fold each leg in half, selvage to selvage. Line the selvage edges up with the selvage edges of the other leg and lay those 2 pieces on top of each other. So the folds are together and the selvage edges are together, and you should have 4 layers of fabric. Now we're going to draw the crotch curve. We're going to draw the crotch curve on the selvage edge side of the fabric. Keep in mind that if your fabric is directional, meaning it has a print that is obviously with one side up, or it has a nap where if it's brushed one way or the other, you can see a difference. You want to make sure that the direction of the print or the direction of the nap is going in the same direction on these 2 pieces that are laying on top of each other. And then that way you won't have a print upside down on one leg and right side up on the other, or you won't have 2 different colors of legs from a velvet or some other napped fabric. So we're not going to make the front part of the pattern and the back part of the pattern different. So we can cut all 4 of these out together. So first measure down from the top edge of the fabric, the total crotch depth distance. Mark a line at this height parallel to the cut edge of the fabric. So parallel to the top edge of your fabric. Then measure out from the selvage edge the calculated crotch extension distance. Draw a vertical line that is parallel to the selvage edge along that line from the bottom of, or the crotch depth line all the way up to the top edge of the fabric. Now draw a curve that you can just freehand connecting the vertical line to the horizontal line. The more square you make this, the more space you're going to have in that area for your body. But do not keep it square because we are not square, and that's going to be much harder to sew. Weight your fabric or pin it in place and cut this little section out. Make sure you cut through all 4 layers of the fabric. All right, now to sew. With the right sides of your fabric together, pin your inseams together. That's the selvage edge. Sew both seams and use a seam allowance that sews all the way beyond the visible weirdness of the selvage edge. So that could be anywhere from 1/4 of an inch to 1.5 inches if you have a printed fabric. You should have 2 tubes of fabric now. Press your seams open. Turn one leg right side out and take that right side out leg and shove it into the inside out leg and match up those inseams. Pin those inseams together, matching them, and then pin the rest of the crotch curve. Sew along this crotch curve. I usually use a 1/2 inch seam allowance because I'm really used to that, but if you want to use a 5/8 inch, that's fine as well. Now, we didn't finish the edges of the inseam because we were using the selvage edge and that's already a finished edge. But for the crotch curve, you will want to finish these seams. So go ahead and finish them with just a zigzag stitch. Unless you have a serger and you want to use that, you can do an overcast of some sort. It's up to you whether or not you want to finish them together or if you want to press them open and finish them apart. So now we're almost done. You need to just finish the casings. So to make the top casing, fold down the top of your fabric to the inside of your garment 1/2 inch and press this down. And then fold again 1.5 inches down from that and press that. Now you can pin this in place if you want. I tend to not pin anything. I've pressed it well enough, and since this is going to be really bunchy, it doesn't matter as much if it's perfect. Then let's press for the bottom casings. Press up first 1/4 of an inch, and then press up again 3/4 of an inch, and make sure that you got a good crease there. And again, you can pin this to sew or not. To sew the casings, let's start with the top casing. You need to leave a gap to insert the elastic. For the top casing, the elastic is 1 inch, so leave about 1.5 inches to get the elastic in there. I typically do this right around a center back or center front seam, and then that gap becomes my center back. Back tack or back stitch to start sewing, and then sew the entire perimeter, leaving that gap, and back stitch again. Sew the seam about 1 3/8 inches away from the top folded edge. So that'll be about 1/8 of an inch away from the bottom folded edge. It's okay if you're off a little, but you do need enough space to get the elastic through and allow for the gathering of the fabric. So the thicker fabric you have, the more space you're going to need for it to bunch up. So you may actually need to adjust this or use narrower elastic if you have a really thick fabric. Similarly, you'll sew each of the leg casings. I like to start at the inseam. I leave about 1 inch gap and I sew the perimeter about 5/8 inches away from the folded edge of the bottom folded edge. So that gives me about 5/8 inches for that either 1/4 inch or 3/8 inch elastic. This will actually need a lot more gather space for your fabric because there's a lot more fabric gathers in this area on each leg than there is actually on the waist. If you haven't already measured out and cut your elastic, now is the time to do so. So measure out your top waist elastic, add that inch for overlap, measure out your ankle elastics, cut 2 of them with that extra inch for overlap. Thread your elastic through the casings, trying not to let it twist as you do so. So keep it flat. I like to use a safety pin and pin the non-leading edge, or so the trailing edge of the elastic, to the seam allowance as I'm pulling it through so it doesn't get pulled through and sucked in and then I have to do it all over again. I also like to use a bodkin that clamps on the elastic to pull my elastic through. So something like this, it clamps down and then it has this little ring that you can really choke up on it and it holds tight. My favorite tool for pulling elastic. To sew the elastic closed, I like to overlap by 1 inch, and then I sew 2 lines of stitching on each edge of the elastic, so each end of that elastic. If I can, I do a zigzag, which finishes the edge of the elastic. When sewing the elastic, you might actually need to switch to a stretch needle or a jersey needle. I find that those typically work better when sewing elastic than the universal needles do. Another thing, I usually do the leg elastics first when sewing them shut because they're a little bit harder to deal with, and so then the last thing I have to do is finish the waist casing or the waist elastic, which is a little bit easier to sew than the 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch elastics. If you're using a 1/4 inch and you find that running 2 parallel lines of stitching to sew it shut is like not working, you can run a zigzag the length of that overlap. That works as well. All right, you finish the 2 elastics on the bottom, you finish the waist elastic on the top. Technically, you're done. You can go back and close the gaps in your elastic casings. However, I almost never do. Most likely, the elastic in your pantaloons is going to wear out before the fabric will. And so you may want to leave that gap there, like I do, to get at that elastic in case you need to replace it. And so that's just something to keep in mind. But you're welcome to sew it shut. And if you're sewing these to sell, you may want to sew it shut just to complete the look of the garment. So all right, that's it. That's how to make pantaloons. Please like this video if you found it helpful, and check out the download at the link in the description for more information and a printable measurement sheet. And happy sewing!